The sea was still when the first faint light of dawn crept over the mountains of Leyte. A low band of mist clung to the water, broken only by the dark silhouettes of ships pushing forward in line. On the deck of a Japanese transport, a sailor leaned against the railing, his gloved hands slick with sweat despite the cool morning air. He could see the jagged peaks of the island rising in the haze like a wall, their volcanic shapes etched in blue and gray against the sky. Behind him the convoy stretched outward, hull after hull, freighters and troop ships plowing steadily toward Ormoc Bay. Around them destroyer escorts kept pace, their lean silhouettes bristling with guns, their crews tense at their posts. The sailor shifted his gaze across the waters. All around, the low rumble of engines merged into one vast sound, a throbbing mechanical heartbeat carrying men and machines toward the front. He told himself this was their duty, to bring supplies and reinforcements to the desperate garrisons of Leyte, where General Yamashita's forces were locked in savage battle against the Americans. Yet he could not push aside the unease. The convoy felt exposed, every deck and mast outlined in the glow of the coming day. In the sailor's imagination, unseen eyes were already watching from beyond the mist. He thought of the whispered stories told in Manila, of U.S. submarines and patrol craft lying in wait, striking at night with sudden fury. He had seen the wreckage of other convoys, blackened hulks on the beaches, floating debris still drifting days after an attack. Now, as Leyte's mountains loomed closer, the silence of the sea felt less like safety and more like the prelude to violence. The sailor's fear was not misplaced. What he could not see, what no one aboard the convoy yet knew, was that hidden in the waters ahead, American PT boats were waiting. Engines idled low, their crews crouched in silence, watching the distant columns of smoke rise from the Japanese ships. For hours they had been stalking the convoy, maneuvering unseen, planning the moment when they would strike. The stage was set. The stillness of morning was about to give way to fire and chaos. To understand how this moment came to pass, we must step back from the deck of that Japanese transport and view the larger canvas of the Pacific War in late 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history, had just unfolded across hundreds of miles of ocean. It had ended with the Imperial Japanese Navy broken, its great battleships and carriers shattered by the overwhelming might of the U.S. fleet. Yet even in defeat, Tokyo clung to hope. If reinforcements and supplies could reach Leyte's defenders, perhaps the American advance could still be checked, or at least slowed. Ormoc Bay became the lifeline. Convoy after convoy was dispatched from Manila and other ports, carrying thousands of troops, artillery pieces, ammunition, and fuel. It was a desperate gamble, made in the full knowledge that the seas between Luzon and Leyte had become a killing ground. The Americans understood this lifeline as clearly as the Japanese. For General Douglas MacArthur, who had returned to the Philippines in October, cutting off those convoys was essential to securing Leyte and preparing for the next stage of the war. The U.S. Navy had already inflicted crushing defeats on Japan's fleet, but the task of strangling supply lines fell not only to submarines and carrier aircraft. In the shallow waters around Ormoc Bay, larger warships could not maneuver freely. The mission was given to smaller craft, the Mosquito fleet of patrol torpedo boats. These plywood-hulled, high-speed vessels, armed with torpedoes and machine guns, were perfectly suited to the narrow channels and hidden coves of Leyte. Though tiny compared to the leviathans of the fleet, they would play a decisive role in the coming struggle. By November 1944, the Japanese were already feeling the strain. Each convoy lost meant hundreds or thousands of men never reaching the front, and tons of supplies slipping beneath the waves. Yet they had no choice but to continue. Between late November and early December, multiple convoys made the hazardous journey to Ormoc. Some slipped through under cover of weather, but most paid a heavy price. Submarine wolf packs tore into them in open waters. American aircraft swooped down from Leyte airfields, bombing and strafing transports until they burned. And at night, As the convoys groped their way through the darkness, the PT boats struck, their torpedoes flashing across the water in sudden ambush. Still, on this December morning, hope lingered among the men on deck. They did not yet know the fate that awaited them. As the first full light washed across Ormoc Bay, the convoy pressed forward, unaware that they were entering a trap. The scene had all the calmness of routine, smoke drifting from funnels, the rhythmic churn of propellers, the disciplined watch of escorts scanning the horizon. Yet the very silence of the dawn was deceptive. Just beyond sight, in the gray water and drifting mist, American boats were closing in, ready to unleash a storm that would scatter the convoy, light the sea in fire, and write Ormoc Bay into the history of desperate battles and dying empires. This opening act captures the drama of a moment balanced between order and destruction. It was one convoy among many, one day among countless others in the Pacific campaign. But it stood as a symbol of the larger war, a contest of endurance and attrition, where the ability to supply, to reinforce, to keep armies fighting meant survival. In Ormoc Bay, the collision of those realities was about to erupt, and the Japanese sailors who stared uneasily at Leyte's looming mountains would soon find themselves fighting not just the sea and the enemy, but the inevitability of a war their nation could no longer win. The rain hammered against the corrugated tin roof of a warehouse in Manila as Japanese soldiers filed inside, their uniforms soaked and their rifles slung awkwardly over their shoulders. Crates were stacked high, stamped with the rising sun, filled with ammunition, rice, and barrels of fuel, cargo that would soon be loaded aboard transports bound for Leyte. Among the men sat conscripts pulled from schools and farms, boys with little training, their faces pale and eyes tired. Many clutched small cloth bundles, the last food or keepsakes pressed upon them by families left behind. They waited for orders that would send them into the maw of a war they already suspected could not be won. Outside, officers barked instructions, clerks scribbled manifests, and dock workers strained to hoist supplies, all under the oppressive weight of urgency. Everyone knew the same thing. Without reinforcement, Leyte would fall, and with it, the Philippines. The Philippines had once been a cornerstone of Japan's southern resource zone, seized in the opening months of the Pacific War with shocking speed. By late 1944, that empire was collapsing. The once proud Imperial Japanese Navy had been humbled at the Marianas, losing carriers and air crews in the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American submarines prowled Japan's sea lanes like wolves, sinking freighters faster than they could be built. Aircraft from U.S. carriers swept the seas and skies clean, reducing island strongholds to isolation. By October, General Douglas MacArthur had made good on his famous promise to return. His forces stormed ashore at Leyte on the 20th, determined to use it as a springboard for the liberation of Luzon and the eventual invasion of Japan's home islands. For Tokyo, this was intolerable. The Philippines were not only a strategic bastion, but the artery connecting the home islands to the oil of the Dutch East Indies. Lose Leyte, and the lifeline would be severed. Japan responded with its greatest gamble, the decisive naval showdown at Leyte Gulf. Across 4 days in October, the Imperial Navy threw what remained of its fleets into battle. Battleships, cruisers, and carriers surged into action in multiple thrusts, hoping to crush the invasion force and isolate MacArthur's beachhead. The fighting stretched from the Sibuyan Sea to Surigao Strait, from Cape Engano to the shores of Samar. It ended in catastrophe. The Japanese lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and more than 10,000 men. For all its size, the battle achieved nothing. American transports continued unloading, and reinforcements flowed steadily ashore. The destruction at Leyte Gulf marked the end of Japan as a major naval power, but Tokyo refused to concede. If the fleet had failed, then the task of saving Leyte would fall to convoys, merchant ships and escorts carrying men and material across seas now dominated by the enemy. The decision was as desperate as it was necessary. Every convoy meant risking precious ships in waters where American submarines lurked unseen. By 1944, Japan's merchant fleet had already been reduced to a fraction of its former strength. Once numbering over 6 million tons at the war's start, it had been cut in half by relentless U.S. submarine campaigns. Tankers carrying oil, freighters bearing coal, and troop transports ferrying reinforcements were sent to the bottom with such regularity that Japanese industry and armies alike were starving for resources. Yet for Leyte, convoys were organized again and again. From Manila, Cebu, and other ports, ships were gathered, loaded with troops, sometimes as many as 10,000 men in a single convoy, along with artillery pieces, rations, and fuel desperately needed to continue the fight. Escort vessels, destroyers, and small anti-submarine craft were mustered, though many were obsolete or underarmed compared to their American counterparts. The voyage to Leyte was a nightmare. Maps of the region reveal the gauntlet convoys faced. Submarine wolf packs prowled the Surigao and Camotes seas, while American aircraft based on Leyte and nearby islands flew constant patrols. The sea lanes themselves were treacherous, forcing convoys into predictable routes. Japanese sailors sailed with the grim knowledge that at any moment, a periscope might rise from the waves, or the drone of engines might herald an airstrike. Losses mounted with terrifying speed. Convoy TA-3, for example, dispatched in late November, lost multiple transports and escorts to submarines and planes before it could reach Ormoc. Those who survived spoke of seas turned black with oil and flame, men clinging to debris as sharks circled. Still, Tokyo insisted reinforcements must continue. General Yamashita's army in the Philippines, called the Tiger of Malaya for his earlier triumphs, was now fighting a losing battle. On Leyte, Japanese troops dug into mountain strongholds and jungle redoubts, hoping to bleed the Americans white. But without food, ammunition, and fresh troops, the defense would collapse. Each convoy became a roll of the dice with the fate of the Philippines at stake. For the soldiers loaded aboard these transports, the sense of foreboding was heavy. Letters written by men before departure often carried tones of resignation, as though they knew the odds were against them. Some scribbled final words to families, entrusting them to friends in case they never arrived. Others carried with them the quiet rituals of faith, prayer beads, paper charms, or small shrines, hoping for protection on seas that had become graveyards. American intelligence knew these convoys were coming. Signals, intercepts, and aerial reconnaissance tracked their movements, and submarines and PT boats were dispatched to intercept. It became a battle of endurance. Would the convoys slip through under cover of storms and darkness, or would the Americans find them first? The story of these convoys is not only one of strategy and desperation, but of scale. Between October and December 1944, more than 20 convoys were dispatched to Leyte, carrying tens of thousands of troops. Roughly half were destroyed or turned back. The cost in lives was staggering. Estimates suggest more than 20,000 Japanese soldiers perished at sea, drowned before they could even set foot on Leyte's shores. In contrast, the Americans lost only a handful of PT boats and submarines. The imbalance of power was absolute, and yet Tokyo persisted, unwilling to surrender the Philippines without exhausting every means at its disposal. By early December, the pattern was clear. The Japanese High Command continued to send convoys despite near-certain destruction, while American forces tightened their grip around Leyte. U.S. patrols grew bolder, airstrikes more frequent, and the PT boats honed their ambush tactics. Each new Japanese convoy carried not only supplies and men, but also the weight of futility. For the commanders planning these operations, it was no longer a question of whether they would succeed, but how much they would lose in the attempt. The road to Leyte was thus paved with desperation. For Japan, it represented the last chance to keep the Philippines in their grasp. For the United States, it was proof that sea control, not just battles won, but supply lines strangled, was the decisive factor in the Pacific War. And as the convoys crept toward Ormoc Bay, every deckhand, soldier, and officer knew they were sailing into the teeth of an enemy that never slept. The outcome of this gamble would be written not in sweeping fleet actions, but in the burning hulks of transports and the shattered hopes of men who never reached shore. And in the waters of Ormoc Bay, where mountains cast long shadows across the dawn, that truth was about to be demonstrated with brutal clarity. The moon hung low over the Pacific, silver light glinting across the restless waves, when three men crouched in the cramped engine room of a patrol torpedo boat. Sweat dripped down their faces despite the night air. Their hands were black with grease as they worked the wrenches, tightening bolts and adjusting valves on three massive Packard engines. The roar of the machines would soon echo across the sea, but for now there was only the tense clatter of tools and the smell of oil and salt. Above them, on deck, others checked the torpedo tubes, their steel noses pointed outward like lances waiting for a charge. Still more crewmen adjusted the twin 50-caliber machine guns mounted in swiveling turrets, scanning the horizon as though an enemy destroyer might appear out of the darkness at any moment. They were preparing for another night run, the kind that demanded silence one moment and unleashed thunder the next. To the men who served aboard them, the PT boats were more than craft. They were predators of the night, fast, fragile, and lethal. These were the vessels Americans came to call the Mosquito Fleet. The nickname was fitting. Small, agile, and biting, they swarmed where larger ships dared not go. A typical PT boat measured just 80 feet in length, built not of heavy steel but of layered plywood. This made them quick to produce, light on the water, and capable of breathtaking speed. Driven by three 12-cylinder Packard gasoline engines, each producing over 1,200 horsepower, they could reach speeds of 40 knots, more than 45 miles per hour across open water. For the crew of 12 to 17 men who rowed them, the boats were both thrilling and terrifying. A single shell from an enemy destroyer could reduce them to splinters, yet in return, they carried 4 torpedoes, depth charges, and an arsenal of guns that could shred smaller craft or riddle a freighter's decks with fire. Training aboard these boats was grueling. Recruits quickly learned that life on a PT boat left no room for hesitation. Crews drilled in gunnery by firing at towed targets, the tracers stitching across the night sky as instructors barked corrections. Torpedo practice demanded nerves of steel, charging at full speed toward a silhouette target, holding steady as the tubes launched their deadly cargo, and peeling away before an imagined broadside could smash them. The men were taught to maintain their engines with an intimacy bordering on obsession. Every spark plug, every line of wiring, every drop of oil had to be checked and rechecked. A Packard engine that failed in the wrong moment could mean death for the entire crew. For many sailors who had dreamed of battleships and cruisers, the PT boats seemed primitive, but those who served on them came to understand their purpose. They were weapons of harassment, raiders that struck fast and disappeared before the enemy could respond. The strategy behind their deployment was as daring as the boats themselves. In the wide Pacific, where fleets clashed with thunderous guns and dive bombers fell from the sky, the PT boats carved out a niche all their own. They prowled coastlines, ambushed convoys, and patrolled narrow straits under cover of darkness. In the Philippines, their role grew especially critical. The shallow bays and reef-studded channels around Leyte and Ormoc made large American destroyers and cruisers vulnerable, but the PT boats could dart in and out with ease. Theirs was a war of shadows, fought with stealth and sudden violence. For Japanese convoys attempting to slip men and supplies through these waters, the sight, or even the rumor, of PT boats was enough to spread alarm. The boats themselves were the product of American industrial ingenuity. Built in large numbers by companies like Elko and Higgins, their construction required no heavy shipyards. Plywood, engines, and standardized fittings allowed rapid assembly. By 1944, hundreds had been launched across the Pacific, filling bases from New Guinea to the Solomons, from the Aleutians to the Philippines. They were cheap compared to the vast warships that dominated headlines, but they carried an outsized impact. In the Solomon Islands, they had already harassed Japanese supply barges during the desperate battles for Guadalcanal. In New Guinea, they ferried commandos, raided shore positions, and forced Japanese convoys to scatter. In every campaign, they proved that in modern war, small craft could wield influence far beyond their size. For the men aboard them, each mission was a gamble. Nights at sea were a test of endurance, staring into the black horizon, straining to distinguish friend from foe, listening for the echo of distant engines. Torpedo runs were over in minutes, but felt like hours. A PT boat charging at high speed toward an enemy convoy had to close the range before releasing its weapons. The wake of its torpedoes, glowing faintly in the moonlight, often revealed its position, inviting enemy gunners to open fire. More than once, PT boats were forced to weave and jink through curtains of tracer fire, shells erupting around them as they tried to escape. Survivors remembered the blinding flashes, the screams of wounded comrades, and the sudden chaos when fuel lines or ammunition stores ignited. Yet they also remembered the exhilaration of a successful strike, the moment when a torpedo slammed into the side of a transport, lighting the night with fire and thunder. The Mosquito fleet also carried a symbolic weight. In contrast to the massive aircraft carriers and battleships that defined American naval supremacy, the PT boats represented ingenuity, improvisation, and raw courage. They showed that even in an industrial war dominated by machines of staggering size, there was still room for small groups of men to make a decisive impact. It was a truth embodied by one of the boat's most famous veterans, John F. Kennedy, who commanded PT-109 in the Solomons and survived its destruction by enemy ramming. His story, retold countless times, gave the PT boats a place in the American imagination. By late 1944, their mission reached a new crescendo in the waters of Leyte. As Japanese convoys threaded toward Ormoc Bay, the PT squadrons stationed there became the sharp edge of the American interdiction effort. Night after night, they patrolled the approaches, listening for the faint vibrations of engines and watching for silhouettes on the horizon. They were the hunters in shallow seas, tasked with tearing into the lifeline Japan could not afford to lose. The crews knew the risks. Enemy escorts were alert, Japanese gunners quick to unleash storms of fire at any hint of movement. But the PT boats thrived on those odds. Their very survival depended on speed, stealth, and daring, and in those qualities, they excelled. As the convoys grew larger and the stakes higher, the PT boats prepared themselves for battles that would decide the fate of Leyte. Their engines were tuned to perfection, their torpedoes armed, their crews hardened by months of raiding. The stage was set for a collision between fragile plywood craft and steel transports, burdened with the last hopes of an empire. And in Ormoc Bay, under the cover of darkness and the weight of desperation, the Mosquito fleet would show just how deadly a swarm could be. The night was so dark it seemed to swallow the horizon, the kind of blackness where sea and sky fused into a single endless void. Aboard PT-491, the crew crouched low, their eyes straining through binoculars, scanning for any hint of movement on the water. The only light came from the faint glow of phosphorus stirred by the wake of their boat, trailing behind like ghostly green fire. Suddenly, one of the lookouts stiffened. Far off, a shape loomed against the starlit sky, too large, too steady to be a trick of the imagination. Engines were throttled down, and the crew froze in silence. Ahead of them, a Japanese convoy was threading through the waters of Ormoc Bay. The hunt had begun. The PT boats lived for nights like this. They were designed for speed and ambush, striking in darkness where their fragile wooden hulls stood a chance against steel giants. As early as mid-November 1944, American PT squadrons had begun to probe the approaches to Leyte, searching for convoys attempting to reinforce the island. Japanese transports and escorts usually moved at night, hoping to avoid American aircraft, but in doing so they sailed directly into the territory of the Mosquito fleet. Each night became a contest of nerves, engines, and shadows, with PT crews waiting in silence until the moment came to strike. Their first skirmishes were chaotic affairs, testing both the courage of the crews and the tactics of their commanders. A convoy would be sighted, lines of black silhouettes moving against the horizon, their smokestacks just visible in moonlight. PT boats, operating in pairs or threes, would creep into position. The approach was agonizingly slow, for every splash or mechanical noise risked detection. Then, at the order, throttles would slam forward, the Packard engines roaring to life as the boats surged toward their prey. Torpedoes were launched at close range, their wakes cutting through the dark sea like glowing knives. A moment later, explosions erupted, geysers of water and flame rising as the enemy ships twisted in confusion. The Japanese convoys were not helpless. Destroyers and patrol craft escorting the transports opened fire with every gun they had. Tracers lanced across the water, brilliant arcs of red and green tearing through the night. Heavy shells whistled overhead, smashing into the waves with towering plumes. More than once, PT boats found themselves the target of withering barrages, their crews diving for cover as splinters ripped through decks. But the very violence of the enemy's response often sowed confusion among their own ranks. Japanese gunners, blinded by muzzle flashes and frantic to hit the small darting targets, sometimes fired on each other or into the sea in blind fury. Amid this chaos, the PT boats made their escape, weaving through curtains of fire and vanishing once again into the black. Success was measured in small victories. A single transport struck by torpedo meant hundreds of enemy soldiers lost before they could reach Leyte's shores. Even when hits were not scored, the effect of the attacks was profound. Convoys broke formation, ships scattered, and schedules slipped. A voyage that might have delivered reinforcements in a single night stretched into multiple days, each hour increasing the risk of submarine attack or daylight air raids. For the Japanese, it was death by 1,000 cuts, each raid tightening the noose around their already fragile supply lines. The men who fought these skirmishes carried vivid memories of them for the rest of their lives. Sailors described how the sea seemed alive during battle, streaked with tracer fire and boiling with explosions. They recalled the eerie beauty of torpedo wakes glimmering under the stars, followed by the shattering roar of impact when one found its mark. Survivors remembered scrambling across burning decks, men leaping into the water as their ships disintegrated around them. For the PT crews, there was always the moment of raw exhilaration, seeing their target erupt in flame, followed instantly by the desperate scramble to escape before enemy shells could find them. By the end of November, these raids had become a nightly ordeal for Japanese convoys. American patrols knew the routes, and every attempt to run men and supplies into Ormoc Bay was met with harassment. Some convoys were broken apart before reaching their destination. Their ships sunk or turned back. Others staggered into port with heavy losses, delivering only a fraction of the men they had carried. The effect on morale was devastating. Japanese soldiers waiting ashore wrote bitterly of supplies that never arrived, of comrades swallowed by the sea before they could join the fight. Commanders pleaded for more reinforcements, but Tokyo's orders remained the same. Convoys must sail no matter the cost. For the Americans, these early skirmishes revealed both the strengths and the limitations of their Mosquito fleet. The PT boats were deadly in the right conditions, but they were not invincible. Torpedoes sometimes malfunctioned, running too deep or failing to detonate. Radar sets were crude compared to those on larger ships, and visual sightings were still the most reliable way to find convoys. A single hit from enemy guns could cripple or destroy a boat in an instant. Yet the psychological effect they achieved far outweighed their material cost. To the Japanese, the waters around Ormoc became a haunted place. Every ripple of phosphorescence or distant engine noise a potential sign of approaching PT boats. These skirmishes built steadily toward a larger crescendo, Each night raid inflicted more damage, slowed more convoys, and forced the Japanese deeper into desperation. The attrition mounted, and the balance of power tilted ever more heavily against Japan. The PT boats had proven their worth, not as battle-winning juggernauts, but as relentless predators that could stalk, harass, and bleed an enemy already weakened by the loss of its fleet. And so, as December approached, the stage was set for something larger. The convoys would not stop, and the PT boats would not relent. On the horizon loomed a decisive encounter, when fragile plywood boats and steel transports would collide in one of the most dramatic clashes of the Philippine campaign. The night sea, which had already seen so many scattered skirmishes, was about to host a battle that would burn its memory into the war forever. The night of December 2nd, 1944, settled thick and heavy over Ormoc Bay. Clouds blanketed the sky, blotting out the stars, and the sea lay flat under a suffocating darkness. Out beyond the coast of Leyte, the sound of engines rumbled low, a mechanical heartbeat reverberating across the still water. In the gloom, a Japanese convoy groped its way toward shore, blacked-out ships gliding like shadows, each stacked high with soldiers, ammunition, and supplies. On the decks, men huddled together, clutching rifles and packs, their eyes straining at the invisible horizon. They prayed silently that this night, unlike so many others, would end in safe arrival. What they could not see, hidden in the black water ahead, were the hunters. American PT boats, their engines throttled back, floated low in the swells, waiting. Crews crouched at their posts, hands resting on throttles and triggers, binoculars sweeping the dark. The air reeked of gasoline, oil, and sweat. The men whispered in clipped tones, each word swallowed by the sea. They had been here before, night after night, but tonight the stakes were higher. Intelligence had warned of a major convoy bound for Ormoc. If they struck hard enough, they could break the back of Japan's last desperate reinforcement effort. The clock ticked past midnight when the first outlines appeared, faint shapes looming in the haze, lines of black bulk against the deeper black of the sky. PT-490 and her companions crept forward, edging into position like wolves circling a herd. Radar blips confirmed what the crew's eyes strained to see. Multiple transports, destroyers screening their flanks, all plowing southward. The Americans waited until the range closed, every second a test of nerve. At the order, throttles slammed forward. Engines howled. The PT boats leapt from the darkness, slicing through the waves at full speed. Torpedoes streaked into the night. Their wakes glowed faintly. Long white scars etched across the black water. A heartbeat later, the sea erupted. A transport shuddered as steel split open, a geyser of flame and water shooting skyward. Soldiers on deck screamed as the blast hurled them into the air. Within minutes, the convoy dissolved into chaos. Searchlights stabbed out across the waves, sweeping wildly, trying to pin down the attackers. Tracer fire erupted, red and green arcs hissing over the water. Shells slammed into the sea, fountains of spray exploding where the PT boats had been only seconds earlier. The Japanese escorts fought with ferocity. Destroyers, their guns blazing, opened fire in all directions. Their commanders barked orders, desperate to herd the convoy into some semblance of order, but confusion reigned. In the din of gunfire and detonations, signals were lost, formations broke, and panic spread. Some escorts fired into the darkness at imagined targets, while others swerved dangerously close to the very transports they were meant to protect. From the decks of the Japanese troop ships, the scene was one of horror. Soldiers clutched the rails as tracers arced overhead. Explosions rocked the hull beneath their feet, and flames licked skyward from struck vessels. When torpedoes found their marks, men hurled themselves into the sea, their cries drowned by the thunder of detonations. For the PT crews, the battle was a razor's edge between triumph and annihilation. They charged at transports so close they could see men running on deck, hear the crack of rifles above the roar of engines. Torpedoes spat from their tubes at point-blank range. Machine guns chattered, cutting down gunners who returned fire from the transports. Wooden hulls splintered under near misses, and every maneuver felt like threading a needle through a curtain of fire. Yet adrenaline surged with each strike. A transport afire was a victory far out of proportion to the size of the attackers. For every vessel lost, thousands of enemy troops would never reach the front. In Ormoc Bay, the sea itself seemed to catch fire. Ships burned like floating torches, flames reflecting off the black surface. Smoke rolled low, choking the air and masking the moon. Amid it all, the PT boats weaved in and out, firing and vanishing, their small silhouettes darting where the larger escorts could not follow. Survivors later recalled the sight of men in the water, their bodies illuminated by fire and tracer light, clinging desperately to debris as oil slicks spread around them. Some were pulled under by suction as their ships slipped beneath the waves. Others floated helplessly as the battle raged above their heads. Minute by minute, the destruction mounted. One transport after another was hit. Some capsized, rolling onto their sides before vanishing in cascades of bubbles. Others lingered, burning fiercely, their decks collapsing as ammunition stores exploded. Japanese commanders tried to press forward, to drive the surviving ships into Ormoc's harbor, but the Americans clung to them like shadows. Torpedo attacks from multiple angles forced the convoy to scatter, each ship fending for itself in the inferno. The once ordered column became a mass of fleeing silhouettes, each outlined by fire. The battle reached its crescendo as a massive explosion split the night. One transport, packed with soldiers and fuel, detonated in a ball of fire so vast it lit the entire bay. For miles around, the shockwave rippled across the water, and the sky turned red with flame. PT crews cheered and cursed in equal measure, exhilarated by the blow, yet chilled by the sheer destruction it represented. To the men in the water, it was an apocalypse. Burning debris rained down, and waves of scalding oil swept across the surface, consuming those struggling to survive. By the time the battle began to ebb, Ormoc Bay was littered with wreckage. Flames still burned on the water, casting a hellish glow over the scene. The PT boats, their fuel low and torpedoes expended, withdrew into the night, leaving devastation in their wake. Behind them, the Japanese convoy was broken. Transports burned or sank, escorts were scattered, and thousands of men were dead or drowning. The survivors who did reach shore did so shattered, many without weapons, supplies, or hope. For the Americans, the Battle of Ormoc Bay marked one of the most successful strikes of the Mosquito fleet. In a single night, they had crippled Japan's attempt to reinforce Leyte, proving once again that speed, daring, and precision could triumph against overwhelming odds. Yet for the men who had lived through it, the memory was less of triumph than of terror. The faces of drowning soldiers, the thunder of collapsing ships, the relentless spray of gunfire in the night. When dawn finally broke, the waters of Ormoc were strewn with the evidence of catastrophe. Blackened hulls smoldered, lifeboats drifted empty, and bodies floated amid the wreckage. The sea, so still at midnight, had become a graveyard by morning. And in the days to come, the Japanese would try again, sending more convoys into the bay, each one destined to suffer the same fate. The night of December 2nd was not the end. It was only the beginning of Ormoc Bay's descent into fire and ruin. The morning after the ambush in Ormoc Bay, the shoreline was choked with wreckage. Blackened hulks smoldered where transports had run aground, their twisted frames still smoking, while oil slicks stretched far across the water, catching the light of dawn in rainbow streaks. Among the debris drifted bodies of soldiers who had never reached land, their uniforms waterlogged, their faces pale in the surf. Survivors stumbled ashore, dazed, many stripped of rifles and packs, some wounded, all hollow-eyed. They had sailed from Manila only days before with banners waving and officers barking promises of victory. Now they were remnants, ashore without supplies or command, staring blankly at the mountains of Leyte, where the battle still raged. For the Japanese High Command, the catastrophe of December 2nd did not end the effort. Despite the staggering losses, orders went out. Convoys must continue. General Yamashita's divisions on Leyte were bleeding under relentless American assaults, and their only chance of survival was reinforcement. Tokyo demanded that more troops be sent, regardless of cost. The Imperial Navy, already crippled after Leyte Gulf, could not contest the seas. Instead, the task fell to a patchwork of transports, barges, and escorts, drawn from what remained of Japan's dwindling fleet. Each voyage was a gamble, each convoy a sacrifice in the making. The Americans, by contrast, tightened their grip with cold precision. Submarines prowled the approaches to Leyte, their periscopes slicing through the swells as they waited for the convoys. Aircraft from Leyte and Mindoro scoured the skies, ready to swoop down on any vessel daring to move by day. And always, lurking in the bays and straits, the PT boats prowled, darting from the shadows at night to strike. Together, these forces formed a net from which few Japanese ships escaped. In the weeks that followed, convoy after convoy met disaster. On December 7th, a group of transports and escorts was intercepted and torn apart by submarines lying in wait. Torpedoes ripped through hulls, sending columns of flame into the sky as men leapt into burning seas. Only a handful of vessels staggered through. Days later, American aircraft descended on another convoy caught in daylight, bombs smashing into decks loaded with ammunition, igniting explosions that could be seen from miles away. Survivors recalled the sheer helplessness as planes screamed down from the sun, their machine guns stitching across decks crowded with soldiers, the transports breaking apart beneath them before a shot could be fired in return. Desperation drove the Japanese to extremes, with transports sinking faster than they could be dispatched. Smaller craft were pressed into service. Troops were packed into barges, fishing boats, and even rafts, lashed together and pushed out to sea in hopes of slipping past American patrols. At night, they hugged coastlines, attempting to use squalls and storms as cover. But the Pacific was merciless. PT boats, guided by radar and sharp-eyed lookouts, intercepted many of these improvised flotillas. The results were slaughter. Tracer fire raked the barges, torpedoes split them apart, and men flailed in the water as the fragile craft disintegrated around them. Those who did manage to land arrived starving, often without weapons or ammunition, unable to reinforce the battle in any meaningful way. The human toll was staggering. Japanese soldiers wrote of voyages that became floating coffins, of men crushed below decks when torpedoes struck, of oil fires that turned the sea into a blazing trap. Survivors remembered clinging to driftwood for hours, only to see comrades slip away one by one into the waves. Thousands never made it ashore. Historians estimate that between November and December, more than 20,000 men were lost at sea in the effort to reinforce Leyte, a figure equal to entire divisions drowned before they could fire a shot. It was a sacrifice without return, a hemorrhage of men and material Japan could no longer afford. On Leyte itself, the consequences were immediate. Units awaiting reinforcements fought on with dwindling ammunition and failing morale. Commanders who had been promised supplies and fresh troops instead received only fragments, hundreds where thousands had been pledged, crates of food where ships of provisions had been expected. Soldiers dug deeper into mountain strongholds, but hunger gnawed at their resolve. Letters recovered after the war spoke of despair, of men watching the skies for planes that never came, the seas for convoys that never arrived. In the end, they knew they had been abandoned to die, stranded by a navy that could no longer command the waters. The contrast could not have been sharper. American forces tightened their stranglehold with methodical efficiency. PT boat squadrons refined their ambushes, striking faster and withdrawing before escorts could respond. Submarine captains reported entire convoys wiped out in single attacks. Pilots described ships erupting under their bombs like volcanoes, the air thick with smoke and flame. To the Americans, this was victory by denial, the destruction of an enemy not through pitched battles, but by starving him of the ability to fight. For the Japanese, it was a descent into futility. Every convoy sent was another column of smoke rising on the horizon, another graveyard at sea. By late December, the so-called reinforcement convoy to Leyte had become a bitter phrase among Japanese troops. They joked grimly of being sent to join the fishes, of being drafted not as soldiers, but as sacrifices to the sea. The name itself came to symbolize futility. Men ordered to board ships with little expectation of ever disembarking. Some officers attempted to maintain discipline with harsh words and ritual displays of courage, but the truth could not be hidden. The convoys had become little more than floating cemeteries, feeding men into the maw of American sea power with no hope of return. The struggle for Leyte was already decided, though neither side fully grasped it in the moment. For Japan, the attempt to reinforce the island was not merely a failure, it was a catastrophe. Entire divisions dissolved in the waters of Ormoc Bay, their soldiers swallowed by the sea before they could join the fight. For the Americans, the destruction of these convoys confirmed the iron law of modern war. Control the sea lanes, and the enemy will wither, no matter how fiercely he fights on land. As 1944 drew to a close, the waters around Leyte stood as a monument to this truth. Wreckage still floated in the bay, a silent testimony to ships and men lost in the desperate gamble. The battle for Leyte would continue into the mountains and jungles, but its outcome had already been written in fire on the sea. Japan had gambled everything to hold the Philippines, and lost it, not only in great fleet actions, but in the attrition of convoys that never reached their destination. At first light over Ormoc Bay, the waters lay calm and glassy. A thin mist clung to the shoreline, curling around the volcanic peaks of Leyte. Fishing canoes drifted out from villages, their crews silent as they paddled past jagged silhouettes that still jutted above the waves, blackened masts, twisted steel, and the half-submerged carcasses of transports. What had once been a battlefield of flame and thunder was now eerily quiet, the wreckage drifting as a grave marker to thousands of men who never reached the shore. The sunrise cast everything in soft gold, but beneath the stillness lingered the memory of nights when the bay had burned, when every ripple carried the echo of gunfire, and every wave hid the dead. Ormoc Bay's story was not only about the destruction of ships, but about the collapse of an empire that had lost its lifeline. Japan's strategy in the Philippines depended on the ability to reinforce and resupply its garrisons. Once that ability was broken, defeat was inevitable. The convoy battles of November and December 1944 proved the harsh arithmetic of modern war. An army without food, fuel, and ammunition cannot stand, no matter how fanatical its soldiers or how desperate its commanders. Historians would later call Ormoc Bay the graveyard of the reinforcement convoy to Leyte, a name that captured both the tactical disaster and the futility of Tokyo's orders. Every transport sunk was not merely a ship lost, but a fragment of Japan's war effort dissolved into the sea. The role of the PT boats in this destruction was out of proportion to their size. Built of plywood, powered by engines better suited to racing yachts, they were never meant to stand toe-to-toe with destroyers or to fight sustained battles. Yet their speed, agility, and the audacity of their crews made them perfectly suited to the shallow bays and narrow straits where larger vessels could not maneuver. At Ormoc, they demonstrated how small units, armed with the right tools and tactics, could cripple a major logistical effort. American sailors who served aboard them remembered the exhaustion of endless patrols, the smell of gasoline that clung to their clothes, and the terror of charging into convoys lit by tracers and explosions. For many, The victories came at the cost of nerves frayed to the edge, nights without sleep, and the sight of death so close they could never forget it. For the Japanese soldiers who drowned in the bay, the legacy was one of abandonment. Letters never delivered, diaries later recovered from bodies or survivors, spoke of resignation and bitterness. Men wrote of being packed into ships like cattle, of praying for the chance simply to reach shore and die fighting, rather than vanish into the sea. Some recalled watching comrades struggle in the surf, only to be swept under by burning oil or dragged into the depths as transports went down. Their sacrifice never changed the outcome, but it underscored the desperation of a nation fighting long after its strategic position was lost. On a larger scale, Ormoc Bay illustrated the central truth of the Pacific War. Logistics was destiny. The United States, with its vast shipyards, oil reserves, and industrial output, could replace losses and extend power across oceans. Japan, cut off from resources and unable to protect its convoys, could not. The destruction of reinforcements at Ormoc sealed the fate of Leyte, but more importantly, it symbolized the unraveling of Japan's capacity to wage war at all. From that point forward, every island garrison across the Pacific was isolated, left to wither without support. The empire that had once stretched from the Aleutians to New Guinea was reduced to starving outposts, while its people at home faced blockade and bombardment. For historians, the battle is a study in contrasts. On one side stood Japan, driven to improvisation, sending men in barges and small craft across seas they no longer controlled. On the other side stood America, wielding a seamless web of submarines, aircraft, and patrol boats, each arm working in concert to suffocate the enemy's lifelines. It was not a duel of battleships or a clash of fleets that decided the Philippines, but the slow, grinding destruction of supply. Ormoc Bay became the place where that destruction reached its most brutal clarity. Veterans of the Mosquito fleet would carry the memories home. They spoke of the exhilaration of watching torpedoes strike true, the fear of being caught in the glare of searchlights, the camaraderie of crews bound together by nights of terror and triumph. Some remembered the faces of Japanese soldiers thrown into the sea, illuminated in firelight, haunting them long after the war was over. For them, victory had not come cheaply. It had been purchased in sleepless nights, in the constant gamble of plywood hulls against steel warships, in the knowledge that they were expendable even as they turned the tide. In the end, Ormoc Bay's legacy was not simply one of destruction, but of revelation. It revealed that the mightiest empire in Asia could be undone not only by grand battles, but by the quiet persistence of interdiction, the relentless cutting of arteries that kept its armies alive. It revealed that small craft, dismissed by some as nuisances, could alter the fate of campaigns when wielded with daring and skill. And it revealed the human cost of desperation. Thousands of men consigned to the sea, their lives extinguished not in glory, but in the futile attempt to reinforce a front already lost. As the camera lingers on the waters of Ormoc Bay today, calm and bright under the Philippine sun, it is difficult to imagine the inferno that once consumed them. Fishermen now cast their nets where convoys once burned. Children play on beaches where wreckage once washed ashore. Yet beneath the surface still lie the bones of ships and men, silent witnesses to the struggle that decided the fate of the Philippines. The bay stands as a reminder that empires do not always fall in decisive clashes of fleets, but often in the slow suffocation of supply lines, in the attrition that leaves armies stranded and nations broken. And so the story closes where it began, with the dawn over Ormoc Bay. The sunrise illuminates waters now serene, but once filled with flame and death. It is a fitting image for the end of Japan's gamble in the Philippines, and for the enduring lesson of the Pacific War, that speed, daring, and control of the sea decide empires, and that even giants can be toppled by the smallest of swarms.